This video is going to be a little bit different. I've had a few buds. I'm going to be rambling a little bit. And I don't blame you if you don't want to watch it, because obviously I think there may be a handful of people in the world interested in this. But I'm going to be talking about a project that I worked on a long time ago. This project. Right now it's in someone else's hands, but this is Final Fantasy Online. Obviously not the Final Fantasy Online that most people know. But I'm going to talk about the history of it, going back about a decade or so. Shit, almost 15 years now. So back in about 1997-98, I got my first computer. It wasn't much of a computer. It was a 66 megahertz running Windows 98, but you know, it was the fastest thing I'd ever seen. And this was my computer. It wasn't one that was shared. I could do whatever the hell I wanted on it. I played the shit out of Civilization 2. And eventually I decided that I wanted to try making my own game. Before that, my friends and I did a lot of LARPing. We didn't even know what LARPing was, but we basically came up with it on our own. I was often the dungeon master. I came up with the scenarios, I came up with the rules, and I thought, you know, it'd be great if I could bring a video game into real life, and then eventually I had a computer, and I thought if I could bring a real life into a computer game. So I started working on my first project in QBasic. And that project was eventually what became Ramdra. It was a game no one's ever heard of and hardly anyone's ever played. But it was a text-based adventure game in the style of Zork, which I loved at the time. And rather than playing around the White House of Zork, he played around the Yellow House, which just so happened to be the house I lived in at the time. So, a dilapidated house in the game, things falling apart. But it was a functioning text-based adventure game, very much in the style of Zork. At the time, I couldn't really complete the game because I wrote so much text and it was so inefficient that the damn thing wouldn't even compile and run. But it was fun to work on. Kept me busy for a good while. I recall at its height, at the time I finally had to stop working on it, had about 100 kilobytes worth of text, which is just a ton of text. And I had to put it on the shelf for a while. And that was sort of the last I did with my own projects until I started learning C++ later on. So eventually Ramdra was completed though, and you can play that completed version on BYOND if you're interested. It has its own little walkthrough built in, but it doesn't really matter. But it was a while before I was able to finish it. Anyway, back around 2001, I came across this comic on DragonWarrior.com, which surprisingly is still online. And this introduced me to the concept of an online Dragon Warrior game. And I had been a fan of Dragon Warriors for about as long as I can remember. But here was the first time I had any idea that such a thing might exist as an online multiplayer game. I thought it was just a big joke at first, but it turns out it wasn't. From this, I jumped into the Dragon Warrior Online community and played that game for quite some time. I also found a Dragon Warrior MUD that was literally Dragon Warrior 1 remade as a MUD, and you could go in parties and do your thing, and it was quite entertaining. But eventually I came to the realization that, hey, you know what, this was just one game on the platform, and anyone can make their own game. The platform is BYOND for Build Your Own Net Dream. And eventually I started looking into it. At the time I had a semester and a half of C++ under my belt, and I figured why not give it a shot. So I downloaded the development suite, and of course it was free, and I started playing around with it. At the time I was at a boarding high school, and we had a whiteboard on the wall, and that whiteboard was covered with minor goals of things to accomplish in the game that was being developed, and a checklist of things that need to be done. Simple things like, can I get the player character to move in a certain direction if I click there? Can I get a monster to attack? Can I time things like monster attacks? Can I get them to do so in a turn-based manner? You know, really simple things that at the time were major victories, but you know, this game could have gone in any direction. I didn't want to make a clone of Dragon Warrior Online, but seeing that game in its fairly polished state for the time gave me an idea of what could be done. And of course, I didn't know much about the BYOND engine, but I kind of learned as I went along, and I just spammed the newbie help forums until I plow through the various problems as they arose. But I could only do so during the day because at night we didn't have internet access. So basically during the day, posted a bunch of questions on the forums. They were answered during the day, and then at night I did my programming while technically I was supposed to be at sleep for lights out, but anyway, that's when I got most of my work done on this project. So at the time, let's see if this works. This was basically the first version of the game, and there's not much here. You can see there's 5 battle maps, and there's an empty field with nothing in it. So let's load this up, see if it works. That was called Final Fantasy Flashback. There's a naming issue with someone else who was working on their game. The guy who took the rapper's name Raekwon. So really simple stuff. You know, just being able to pick your class from a list was kind of a big deal at the time because I didn't know what the fuck I was doing. I'm just gonna kill the sound, I think. The old sound formats are not compatible with the updated BYOND system. So there's a lot of overlap here, which doesn't really make sense. So this was a battle map. Basically, you went into random battles. When you flash, you're ready to attack. If you clicked, you could do your regular attack. Well, actually, in this version, you had to click a verb to attack. But otherwise, you could say, cast the Fire 1 spell. You could target the Sword Rat in this case. And after a short wait time, you would cast the spell and kill it. Unless it, of course, walked out of range. These are all hand-drawn by me, with the exception of the Final Fantasy graphics, which are obviously lifted from Final Fantasy. But this is the earliest version of the game that's still in existence. And you get an idea of what happens. So get a little bit of gold, a little bit of experience, and then you're back on what's essentially the world map. So that was basically the first version of the game. First workable version of the game, and from there it just kept expanding. So this was June, basically the summer after graduating. This is the version of Final Fantasy Online / Flashback that most people remember, at least the old bees. So the idea was the same. That was, you started out in town, there was some gears scattered around, and Rosa from FF2 was the healer, and Bygan the peddler would sell you things, and if you wanted you could go into Garland's castle. There were a whopping 7 battle maps, and then of course you could try and fight your way through to meet Garland in this not too difficult maze, but you know, it kept people busy for a while. But people kept coming back night after night to play the thing, and every night we'd have our testings, and basically get into just a massive party and just have fun, go beat up on Garland some more. Equipping things was kind of interesting because you click the gloves once and then you double click it to equip it, which led to some funny memes where if you just double clicked it then you dropped it. So obviously some people never figured this out, so they just kept dropping things over and over, but it was fun at the time. Same basic idea for the battle system. If you walked off the roads then you ended up in the battle map, which here's a little bit improved. At this point, we had the slightly evolved battle system where instead of clicking attack and then selecting who you attack, you primed attack, and then when you click, you'd execute your attack. And if the enemy walked out of range, you'd attack a different enemy. So here I've got the sleep spell. If I prime sleep and then cast it on a wolf, if it works, alright, the wolf's now asleep. So now I can wail on the wolf until it's dead. Looks like my broadsword is not equipped. Nope, not able to equip the broadsword, sadly. So this system with the battle maps was sort of characteristic of early FFO, and the idea was, you know, an overworld with a real-time battle system, but encounters that would draw you into battle. And it had a few problems, especially for a PvP-centered game, because you could fight against other parties. So flash forward a little bit, August of 2002. And honestly, in going back and preparing this, the most interesting thing for me has just been going through and looking at the evolution of the maps over time. So this is the state of the map in August 2002. You can see there's an actual town here, which isn't much of a town, but might look familiar to some of you. And obviously it's not a rendered town, so the walls are not rendered, although when the game runs they do render. We have the first instance of an interior of a shop, and we have several of those. And then we have 8 battle maps. And then of course the overworld. And the idea here is essentially the same. That is, you start off here in Coneria, and you walk up and eventually fight your way through increasingly difficult waves of monsters, Garland's temple, and then you have to find your way through a slightly more difficult and elaborate maze, eventually make your way to Garland and then spam train off of them. I'm not going to load this one up, but you get the idea. Same basic premise. Walking around on the overworld draws you into battle, and then once you're in battle, fight the battle on the battle map, and then get some experience, get some items or whatever, and then go back to it. There wasn't much of a game at this point, but surprisingly there was still a lot of people who came and played the damn thing. And we probably get about 20 players at peak times at night, and you know, just basically get into one massive party and go fight some monsters. So after that, things started to change a little bit. Things have started to expand a bit at this point. The last one was early August, and this is mid-August, and already things are changing substantially. So here we've got 25 battle maps to accommodate anyone who might possibly join and want to play, even if they're all in separate parties. And we have a blank map, and the significance here is that people could now join as map editors and make their own maps. So from about this point in August of 2002 until 2003, the sort of general theme was expanding the world, but the battle system remained the same. And you know, as more people came, the world was expanded, a little bit of story was added to a few NPCs here and there, but there wasn't much to the game. There weren't any quests, there weren't any towns. This archive version of the game from July 2003 was probably right before this style of the game was completely removed and changed. So here's sort of the expanded version of Conerio with the associated castle, and this is where you first start to see the emergence of what became the Three Kingdoms. So here we have Salamar, the Wizard's Kingdom. Over here we have, I believe this is Denadros, which was Malthros's brainchild. And then way over here in the southwest we've got Elvawin, which was the, of course, the Elvish Kingdom. But this is also when the warp system was really developed, and we have here sort of the starting area. We've got a very simple castle. We've got shop interiors, and just looking around, obviously this is not organized in any meaningful way, but we've got a simple cave system, and just really starting to expand the scope of the world was sort of the theme here. But the battle system was the same. You walked around on the overworld or in the dungeons, and as you walked around you ended up in random battles, and those random battles took you to the battle map. You finish your battles on the battle map, and then you ended up back in what was effectively the overworld. And for those of you who played later versions of Final Fantasy Online, this might look very familiar to you. But this is sort of the first version of Garland's Castle that kind of looks like Garland's Castle from later on in the game. We've got Elvawin, which sort of mirroring what appears on the overworld. We've got the island town in front of the sort of floating castle was the idea, but didn't quite work out as intended. And we've got the different trainers and stuff, things that became familiar to players later on, I think. Salamar was Salamando's kingdom, and at the time these were just assigned to players, so 3 of the most active players at the time were each assigned their own kingdom, and they could have their own vassals within the kingdom. But of course, they were just effectively large, glorified parties, and they couldn't really fight for control. But there was a lot of role playing at the time, so people kind of role played shifting alliances and whatnot. But obviously, some of the kingdoms were more active than the others, and eventually, Elfwin just became inactive, and Salamar was destroyed by Denadros. For no fault other than Denadros had all the more powerful players, and Salamar was just not active enough to compete. But you get somewhat of an idea of what the thing might have looked like here. So, in order to make it to the throne room of Salamar, you had to navigate a warp puzzle, which if you made it through once, then you knew how to get through it, and you get through it every time after that. But you never encountered it before, it might be a little bit challenging, but not too much. Here's more of this is more of Salamar. I actually forgot about that. So here's part of the Salamar warp puzzle, but it turned out that this was too easy to navigate. So then there was a second, more diabolical warp puzzle that was introduced. As I recall, some of these columns are actually warps as well. In order to navigate the puzzle, you had to not only walk through the proper doors in the right order, but you also had to walk through the proper columns in the right order. And a lot of people got stuck down here, which was the intent, but as before, once you figured out the pattern, you could make your way through no problem. So eventually the kingdom sort of went inactive, and Denadros essentially won the game, which wasn't good for the game as a whole, but that's just kind of the way it went. And sort of a theme that developed, which was for any instance of the game, there was going to be a winner. Someone was going to conquer the world, and that person was going to assert their dominance over it, which was kind of a problem over time. But anyway, this was sort of the first golden age of Final Fantasy Online, which was the Three Kingdoms era. Skipping ahead to 2004. Another sort of recurring theme is that FFO has been remade several times, almost from the ground up. And each time a little bit more efficient, but also slightly different gameplay and mechanics. And each time addressing the issues previously encountered. So back in the Salamar Denadros Elfwin era, the issue was that there were only three kingdoms. They were very static, but once a kingdom gained dominance, it would just take over, and that would pretty much be the end of it. So the idea here was, and this is sort of an incomplete map, but we have the first instance of Newbanian here, which was separate from the world map. And once you're on the world map, you could basically warp around to a few other areas, which one of them was started here but not completed. But the idea was different areas would be controlled by different kingdoms. So this was the first version of what became the feudal system later on. And the idea was, with only three kingdoms, it was too static, and it was too easy to get a monopoly on the power in the world. So with more kingdoms, you could get greater distribution of power. At least that was the idea. But in practice, it didn't quite work out. So this was still an overworld-based random encounter system. You'd walk around, and within an area, each area was controlled by, or each area represented one fiefdom, and fiefs were linked by the players into larger kingdoms and the like. And if you trained within an area, you would strengthen that particular fief, and you could basically tax the lower fiefs to increase your power. And ideally, each of these islands would have been controlled by one kingdom. That's not quite what happened, because it wasn't dynamic at the time. So there was a sort of kingdom auction that took place, or fiefdom auction. And the idea was that you would bet your experience in game, your future experience, against the fiefs, and then you would get the fiefs accordingly. But as before, the people who were the power gamers at the time basically wagered the most, and they got the best lands, and everyone else was kind of left with what was left. So the same basic problems arose. The same kingdoms were represented. Essentially, Denadros was one island, and then the other kingdoms were sort of split. Everyone else had no real power to draw from, and same issue all over again. So obviously the system was not going to work. That being said, people still showed up night after night to join up into mega parties and go training against monsters. So in that sense, it was fun. You know, from the beginning, this was I was making the game that I wanted to play because such a thing didn't exist, and it wasn't that game yet. So I decided it was time for another change, and it also turned out at this time there was a lot of player versus player action, despite the battle system and despite the mega parties. So that was still definitely part of the game, but the problem with the player versus player battle system with the random encounters was that it arbitrarily interrupted the way the combat worked, and especially if people ran away from battle, you'd be stuck in the battle map, and meanwhile they'd be running away, getting in walking through warps and such, and you'd never be able to catch them. Much to everyone's chagrin, I decided that I needed to switch the system from an encounter-based battle map system to something more like Diablo, where all the action takes place on the world map. So here we have the first test of that system, which is basically just Newbanian with some imps thrown on it. So the question was, can you walk around in an overworld map with monsters and interact with them? And the answer to that eventually was yes. So it sort of merged the battle map with the overworld map and made them one and the same. And from there, it grew into the game that most people that played it grew to know and love, which is the random encounters on the world map, which are represented here by these gray squares. As you walk around, monsters spawn, you fight them, and so on. Once that hurdle was crossed, it just became a matter of expanding the map. And to most of you, this will probably look familiar, but this eventually became Newbie Island, and you can see the old spawn system with little gray squares representing where the monsters would spawn if you were in the vicinity. And at the time, you had to walk in order to spawn monsters, but we have the forest north of Newbanian. We've got Aldia for the first time ever. It's been about 2.5 years since the project was first started, and for the first time ever, there was a second actual city that you could enter. So it took a while to get to that point. We've got the swamps over here. We've got Mountain Poison, and then of course leading into what would eventually be Garland's Lair. But you know, it took a while to get to this point. We've got the dungeons, we got the forest dungeon. We've got the catacombs beneath Newbanian. We've got the spider caves, and then we've got the temple, which I believe at the time just had Garland sitting here. But you know, throughout development, there have been a lot of people who've contributed in various ways. It was never going to grow very big, but people always wanted to help contribute, and one of the things that people did was make maps. And the maps were somewhat difficult to integrate, but you can see here there's a map that someone had created, a nice little maze, but it just didn't make it into the game. It was there, it was part of the assets, but it was not technically accessible or part of the game at the time. Things like this would eventually be incorporated later, but at the time it was just something there on the side that could be used if needed, but very kind of a low priority compared to the other stuff, and that was just sort of my own limitation, I guess. I couldn't work on the game quickly enough to add everything that other people had developed for it, so I did all the programming. Most everyone else did mapping, icons, balancing, that sort of thing, and I was definitely the bottleneck, but not so much I could do about that. So Newbanian was a test map, but it took many months in order to really perfect things. And it wasn't until early 2005 that I decided it was time to really venture off the island and expand even further. So this is really the era of sort of map improvements and expansions. So here we have the first instance of Argo that is saved at least. We've got a number of additional caves and areas that were added. There was the sewer area of Arendi, obviously some Arendi caves, And then the final version of Garland's temple, I believe, is here. An early final version of the Erendi areas, the highlands, the castle. And might be the first version of Forgardia. We've got Giant's Helm mostly intact here. This is, of course, Malthros's creation. And it's very different from how it turned out eventually. I believe this whole portion was cut off and the mountains were removed, trimmed down, but this is sort of his work in progress. You know, basically as we went along, it was just a work in progress. Things were perfected and eventually made it into the final version of the game, but this is kind of how the mapping went. Sort of a general concept for an area, eventually trimmed down. Obviously this is way too blocky, and that's why it didn't look like that in the final version, but get an idea of what things might have looked like. And basically at this point I can't even load the maps anymore because the compilation's having some issues, just probably the developments and beyond since that time rendered things no longer compatible. I'm not really sure what the issue is because it's not anything obvious here. So I can't really show you this, but essentially at this point the map was finalized, and from that point a number of things happened. First off, this is about the time they started working on what they call Beyond 4.0. I was a recognized developer in the community, so I was given access to their secret beta version of the development software, which had a number of improvements over the existing version. And rather than waiting for the new beta to become public, I started converting the game to the new version of Beyond, and this became FFO 4.0, which also doesn't compile. So I'm not sure what the issue is there either. But basically, I was testing it from me directly, and then they were helping me test the game with their private beta. And eventually that got leaked, and they were kind of pissed at me, but it was kind of funny at the time, I thought. So we were doing a shit ton of testing on their software as a result, because we had probably 20 or so people working on testing and the like on this private version, not to mention the public version, but never mind that. Yeah, it was sort of the second golden age of FFO, I think. And at the time it was very active. At its peak hours, usually get about 60 to 65 players, which is about all the single server could handle. There was a lot of stuff going on in the background for the AIs. It was good times. So from there, a number of things happened, but there were rumors that fan games on Beyond were probably not going to be around much longer. And there was always talk about changing the Final Fantasy aspects of FFO into something else. But I didn't know what that something else was going to be. And eventually in 2009 I came up with an idea, and that was to keep the core gameplay, but transform the game into something that was definitely not Final Fantasy, but similar in style to the early 8-bit games. So that was the idea behind transforming Final Fantasy Online into Terulia. That started in 2009. Beyond 4.0 was already released, but at that point I started working on a separate forked version of the game, which was FFO in its current state remained FFO. FFO, adapted to not be Final Fantasy, became Terulia, and these were worked on in parallel. And as I made improvements in one, that is, as I worked on Terulia, anything that could be adapted back to the Final Fantasy game was adapted back to the Final Fantasy game. So there were a lot of optimizations at this point. A lot of systems I just went back and completely rewrote, and all of these changes were adapted back, with the exception of the changes that removed the Final Fantasy aspects. Most of the changes that I made to the Final Fantasy version of the game were welcome, but some were less so. And there were changes that I made specifically to address what I thought were the problems with Final Fantasy Online at the time. Some people liked them, a lot of people didn't. And this started the community in various ways, and a lot of people sort of longed for the heyday of FFO without the changes. And some people were driven off, but as before, the issues were that as one group came into power, they sort of dominated the server, and it became easier than ever to dominate the server. There was a lot of drama too, and that's one thing that's been pretty consistent with this community, and that is, it's been a small community on a small map, and this also is why anytime there's a power shift in the game, lots of people get driven off. So if you are constantly being pounded into the ground, then you suddenly get power in the game, you're going to return the favor on anyone who wronged you in the past. And this held true over and over again. Anytime someone new came into power, they basically curb stomp anyone who opposed them previously, take over the game, and drive off anyone else. And for many years, there was a cycle of player wipes, which sort of reset the server, and was one way to address the issue, which is if you start everyone off in the same level playing field, then it's anyone's game and you can make new alliances and stuff. Basically what would happen is we'd restart the server, people would come back who'd left previously, they'd play the game, and probably after a couple months start to see some actual power blocks forming, and maybe 1 or 2 big wars, and then after that someone would win the game, and basically have to start over again, because once someone won, there's no way to come back from that. I always thought that was a problem with FFO, and the P-wipes were one solution, but they weren't the best solution. And there were a number of things I tried over time to deal with it. We tried embassies in Argo. We tried a more distributed means of determining who got what areas. I personally tried to keep the peace between some groups, just to keep them from killing each other, you know, as often as they would otherwise, you know, more or less successfully. I tried sort of infiltrating the community as someone who was obviously not myself, and try and influence it that way, more or less successfully, often less successfully, but somehow or another it kind of worked out. People had fun, at least for a while, until someone took power, and then it was back to square one. Since I was creating this new game anyway from the ashes of FFO, I figured I might as well address the problem, and that was one other major divergence from FFO, and also turned a lot of people off from the idea of Trulia. Sounds like the exact same thing happened on Rust and Ark then, according to Budgie, who's watching the stream right now. Yeah, once you won the game, that was pretty much all there was. And a lot of people just refused to leave Newbie Island as well, because on Newbie Island you're safe from the marauding hordes of player killers. That was another sort of natural result of the PvP system. Yeah, I never left Newbie Island either. I just stayed there for the most part. A lot of people just stayed on Newbie Island. You never had to leave. And Newbie Island was the one area that had quests. So you would do the quests, and the quests would take you pretty much, I don't know how many hours to complete. Because, you know, there'd be a lot of grinding. There wasn't much content, but it was not easy to get through. So unless you had a party of people helping you, you were going to take some time getting through that area on your own, especially if you're trying to solo it. There are a few little NPC helpers that might come, but yeah, there were a lot of people who played the game an unhealthy amount. But there were obviously the casual players, there were a few role players, and then there were the no-lifers who spent every waking moment on this game training, just so they could maintain their power over the rest of the game. And it was amusing to me, but it was definitely not a healthy atmosphere. But that's the way it developed, and everything in the game encouraged that sort of system. So you either teamed up with the no-lifers or you were a no-lifer, and you know, you'd have your 10v10 battles on the world map, and whoever won, you know, not only did you lose the battle, but you also got weaker as a result of losing, because you lost experience, you lost items, you lost gold, You could even lose abilities. You could lose levels in the abilities, and it was not forgiving at all. So God forbid you got killed and did get a prayer said at your tombstone before you respawn, because if you didn't, you were losing a shit ton of stuff. And you know, it made the weak people even weaker. It made the strong people that much stronger. And that's just the way it worked. But people kept playing it, and people would go in to experience debt. They'd actually have negative experience for their level, so they'd have to gain back the negative experience just before they could start gaining experience to get the next level. And it was absolutely absurd. There was a level cap. The level cap rose over time, which meant that the longer the server was up, the higher the level cap was, which meant that there was some limit on how high you could level. But even so, you know, once you hit level 60 or 70 or, you know, however high you could get, no one was ever going to catch you, especially if you had anything out. You had some vendetta against someone, they were not going to be able to train to catch you. You had a monopoly over the good training spots, and there was just nothing you could do at that point other than, you know, try and form some underground resistance or just leave the game until the next P-wipe. In later versions of the game, maps I can't show you because they don't compile. You know, the individual domains like Erandi Guardhouse, Erandi Castle, Chiron, not Aldier, but Giant's Helm, all these places, places where the maps have, you know, an actual city built up. Well, these are just like wide open fields, and people could take over these fields and then build their own cities. So you'd have to bring in the resources, you have to chop the wood, you'd have to mine stone, and you have to carry it, which would be very slow because it weighed a ton. So you have to, like, you know, pile up your wood and then spend 30 minutes dragging it back to your city. And then whoever was in charge would build up the city. And if you're lucky and you put in enough effort, then they might reward you with a building of your own. You know, you get essentially a key to your own building, and then you can, you know, store your loot in it, which was one of the few safe places. You could build up a bank. And there weren't any banks in the non-PvP areas, and that was intentional. So if you were fortunate enough to be part of a domain and you had the massive amount of resources necessary to build a bank, then you could store your money in a safe place. But even that bank could get burned down, and then all your money would just be scattered around, someone could pick it up, run off with it. So, you know, nothing was truly safe. But it was a fun time, because there was a real community then, you know. And there wasn't always a great community, but there was at least a community. And it was just a very unique game. So from that was sort of the second golden age, which I mentioned, and that was around 2007 to 2009, I think. And from there it started to go downhill. I'd say the core community at the time, with our nightly 60 players, and there were probably about 15 to 20 of those who were the real hardcore players, and the rest were just kind of along for the ride. But it made for some really fun drama. I'm not saying drama in a bad way. I'm saying like fun RP kind of drama. And you know, I did some amount of role playing at the time. I didn't like to be myself in the game because you know, it's no fun if everyone just sucks up to you because you made the game, right? So I would get on some other random character, play as a newbie for a while, and, you know, pretend I didn't know what the hell I was doing, and that was a lot of fun. There were rumors that fan games on Beyond were going to be shut down at some point, and that was one of the reasons I started working on Truly in the first place, was that, you know, in case FFO went down, at least I'd already have this other project up and running, which was basically the same thing, just without the Final Fantasy aspects. So 2009, started working on Trulia, and life. So I worked on the game less and less. So in June 2011, Beyond got a cease and desist, which included all Final Fantasy-based and Square Enix property-based fan games on Beyond. And the rumor was that one of my players who was disgruntled at the state of the game and who wanted me to work more on Terulia rather than Final Fantasy Online was the one who reported all of us to Square Enix, and that's why it was taken down. I don't know if that's true or not, It probably is, but honestly, it doesn't matter because I expected this was going to happen for a long time. That's why I started working on Truly in the first place. Anyway, so that was the end of FFO on Beyond, but we still had a server, we still had a game, and we still had forums and everything. So basically, the game just went underground at that point. But that was the end of the 60+ player nightly sessions. But over time, basically, the player base just sort of faded away. So we didn't have the presence on Beyond anymore, which meant that new players really couldn't find the game except by word of mouth. So existing players would sometimes tell their friends about it. Hey, there's this great game that's not like anything else you've ever played before. Come give it a try. If they happen to stick around, great, but more often they didn't. But other than that, there was no real way to find the game. So after that, things settled down a lot. Nightly peak times had about 30 to 35 players, I think. It was still a fun number, but you know, it wasn't like its heyday. At that point, I basically stopped working on any improvements to FFO, and I completely switched over to Truly. But that was also the time when I really started to sort of expand the scope of what was going to be Truly. And it was this time that I took a lot of time to work on some sort of peripheral systems. Already for about the past 2 years before this point, I'd probably been spending more time working on the forums for the game than the actual game. Before this, we spent our time on a board run by Envision Free, and before that, there were some other boards that no longer exist for various reasons, but I always had trouble with maintaining forums for long periods of time, and there were always some strings attached. So around 2009, I decided that rather than, you know, being held hostage by other people's forums, I'd just make my own. So late 2009 was when the Trulia forums opened up, and those are still around today, although they're not very active because obviously there's not much work being done on the game. But that was all made from scratch specifically to integrate with the game itself. So that was a long, very drawn out project, and still some work being done on that. But there were other peripheral systems at the time, so I thought that one way we could get some attention to the game, or one way we could draw attention to the game was by incorporating an inter-game chat system. So for all the things that Beyond can do, one thing it can't do is reliably communicate between games. So I developed one of the first systems to do that, which was truly a relay chat. It's still around, but no one uses it. I don't even use it anymore. But the idea was you could have a chat window in your game and talk with other games or people in other games that use the same system. But there are only a handful of games that ever used it. One of them being FFO, one of them being Trulia when we tested it, and then a few others that hardly anyone ever played. So that was kind of a bust, but it did allow me to learn a lot about how to network between games like that, so it wasn't a complete waste. It was also the basis of the inner server system that eventually developed. But from there, it was just sort of developer hell, development hell. 2011, the cease and desist arrived. But by then, it had already been 2 years of working on the forums and the like, and sort of the peripheral systems, and for every time I went back to look at Truly, it just became, well, here's another system I can rewrite from scratch and make it more efficient than it was before. So there are a lot of things that were improved over time, but for all the improvements, there's less of a game than there was before. So that's kind of where we are right now. It is, for all the different systems that were integrated, that are accessible through the forums, things like balancing, things that used to be a pain in the ass in the game. For all the things that you can do now, there's not much of a game to show for it. And for a long time, I just completely lost interest in working on the thing because any little minor change in the game itself takes a massive amount of work and testing, because no longer is it just one game that's self-sufficient, standalone. Where one small change to the code results in one change to the game, but now it's like 3 different servers talking with each other, and you know, they all have to be in sync with each other, and any minor change or bug in one of them affects the other 2. You have to simultaneously diagnose all of them. And bug fixes are just a nightmare. So all that together has greatly slowed things, even though it's much more efficient than before. And what I'm left with now is a game that's not really playable. So every once in a while I fire it up to do some bug testing and the like, but otherwise there's not much to see. The biggest surprise to me is that there was one version of the game that I ended up giving to someone, Reminiscing, who now runs it, and at the time I was completely done with FFO, working only on Trulia. FFO server was pretty much dead, and he thought he could do something with it. He wanted to actively develop it, and he's done that. So he's actually got an FFO server now, which I didn't even know this is still up until today, but I'll play that for a bit just for nostalgia's sake. I logged in earlier. There were 10 players on. It was honestly more than I expected, but surprisingly the thing's still there. So back in 2009 to 2011, I had very high hopes for Trulia. I thought it was going to surpass FFO by quite a bit, which is why I, you know, kept working on the thing and expanding it. But I don't think that's the case anymore, and it would require so much work to get it to a state that's even comparable to this game, which has been in essentially this state since about 2005 or 6, that honestly I'm not sure it's even worth working on. That being said, I've been playing a lot of games lately, a lot of Paradox games and the like, and eventually reach a point where it's just like, what am I going to do next? And I picked up Truly again. I was like, oh, you know, it's actually kind of fun to work on a game. I'd forgotten because I'd been so caught up in all the bugs and the drama and the bullshit that I just forgot it would be fun to work on a game rather than to play one. So here I am playing a game that I started back 13, 14 years ago. Let's see what how far I get on Newbie Island, I guess. But so yeah, every once in a while I fire up Trulia, do a little bit of testing, some bug fixes, and it's not easy. It takes a lot of time, but when I finally get through an issue and get something to work, it's actually quite rewarding.